Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means for you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, and we're going to talk about competing and relationships. So this is something that Rick has worked with a lot of clients in his practice, specifically in the physique world. Now, I do want to make sure that we touch on things not just physique related, but we are going to dive a little bit more heavily into that because it is more specific. And as we were talking about before, it is just a little bit more taxing. Like competing in anything at a high level is going to be a sacrifice for a relationship, but especially there's a lot of just physiological and psychological things involved with physique sports that are different, like we've talked about a million times on this podcast, that really are just different than any other sport.
I would agree. And so, and this is where it's great to have somebody who's also like a bikini pro who can really speak to the other side of this, because my knowledge on that side is very limited. I only have the experience that I'm coming from is as a clinical therapist working with people who are currently competing or have competed, and the impact that this type of competition takes on a relationship. And so I guess a great way to start would be, the basic phrase is all relationships and relationships that thrive are really about balance. And I feel like a lot of times when I'm working with people who are actively competing, whether it's amateur or pro, that the impact that competing has really does a great way of destabilizing the relationship and making it unbalanced and tipping the scales to one side. And that's kind of where a lot of the relationship problems happen, because it's not an equal proportion within the relationship. And there's a lot of giving or a lot of taking, but not necessarily a lot of back and forth where it needs to be in order to successfully thrive and become healthy. So I guess one of the best ways to kind of start would be, I want to ask you, what is the impact of competing on you as a person, right? Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say that it is a full immersion into this goal, right? It is not a casual thing. Could be a casual thing for some people, right? But at the level that I was competing, I was trying to be my absolute best. I was competing with the pros. I was giving a lot in the off season and particularly during the deficit. So for me, getting that lean is very, very taxing physically. And I think that over time, the more that you do it, you become better at managing yourself, right? I would say that the first few preps can certainly be a little bit harder. You always hear about people like snapping or getting hangry or whatever. And certainly those things do happen. For me, honestly, the biggest side effect was I would just be super brain dead and just super tired. And obviously, me, I'm pretty energetic most of the time. And I'm very talkative and all this. And I could turn it on as I needed to, but then I would just be like a fucking corpse all day. If I had to give a presentation, that would wipe me out all day, right? And you're spending a lot of time doing prep things. So that's going to mean obviously your training session, your cardio sessions are going to be longer. You may be doing 2-a-days depending on kind of where you're at. Some preps have done that. I remember when I was doing my master's research during one of the data collection periods, I was waking up to do, that at 4 a.m., go to the lab, talk to people, do all my research for 6 hours, then go do my first cardio session, then take a little bit of a break, then go lift and do cardio again, all on 50 carbs. It was the absolute worst prep of my life. I looked terrible, but you just do it, right? But so a lot of times it's just a time thing. The food has to be super dialed in. I would say that as I continued to compete, I got much better at being able to do things, but as a new competitor, that can be harder, right? It is easier to say no than it is to actually moderate yourself and actually balance. It's easier to say, hey, I don't want to go out and do this because I don't even be around it. Whereas later in my career, I was like, I don't care. I've chosen to do this, and that's more of a mature competitor thing. But I would say that the biggest side effect was just feeling super wiped out all the time, which certainly takes its toll because, obviously you have to, work. At this point, I was still either doing research in school or coaching or both. And I had to get all that done. So that takes away from everything else. You only have so many buckets, you don't have so much energy. So prep and all of that kind of took precedence. And it can certainly be hard on your partner if they don't understand. I would say if you have a partner who has never competed at a high level, that can certainly be challenging, right? Luckily I did. So it was an understandable balance there. Obviously very different sports, but still somebody who understands being competitive. So I would just say that the overall just exhaustion and just kind of low energy is really what zaps me. And then for me, I get a lot of sleep issues when I prep, meaning I just don't sleep as well because I'm super hungry. And that of course leads you to like, you're like, I'm so tired all day, but then I lay down and I can't fall asleep. You're like, this is so fun. So it's just kind of this perpetual, like, you know, you're tired. But again, that is just part of it. And you get used to that. But to the point of this podcast, yeah, you get used to it. Like, you grind through it. But then what about everybody else? In particular, what about, you know, your significant other?
Right. And so one of the things that I heard from there, which it relates to every single client that I have, is you're trying to manage a career or competing as a bikini pro or in bodybuilding. So you have the competition side of you, but you're also having to manage a work/school side of you, which every single person that I deal with has that balance.
There is very few people who are just competitively bodybuilding, meaning that they're, you know, making a living off of that, you know, obviously not just the prize money, but the sponsorships and all of that. There are certainly people who do.
Sure.
And I know those people, but that is a very small percentage of individuals.
And I think it's a completely different dynamic when you're saying my job is to go to the gym and work out and do this part of it
It's
for
like any
a living.
professional athlete.
Right. And so the dynamic shifts at that point. But for like essentially 99% of people, they have work, they have school, and they're competing. And so that element adds to it. And that's really the focal point of this podcast I want to address, is like that demographic, not the people who are like sponsored, who it's their profession to work out or to compete. And so one of the next questions to really ask would be, what is the impact that competing has on the relationship? And you had the luxury of having somebody who understood what competing means, who's competed at a high level. He could, because he had a similar goal, I think he could also appreciate where you were going and what you were doing. And so he didn't maybe necessarily take it personally or internalize those things. But, you know, when we're talking about a lot of the things that I heard you just kind of rambling through, like the exhaustion, the fatigue, the low energy, you know, the ability to minimize your focus and concentration, constantly being hungry, like the demand of what it takes to compete, like 1 hour of cardio, then go back and do some lifting, then do more cardio, spread out throughout the day. What I didn't really hear in there was like, oh, well, this is the amount of time that I saved for my relationship, right? That was put special for them. Like, where's the priority here? Okay. And that's an important concept that I'm going to keep circling back to, is what is the priority? And if you're the competitor, and I am not talking about just women, I'm talking about men, on any side of this within the bodybuilding community, what you're putting your time, effort, and energy into, that's the priority, right? So it's really difficult for the other person in this relationship to feel like they matter if they don't. And you can sit there and say to me all day, well, you matter to me, and I love you, and I care about you, and I want what's best for you. It's like, okay, as a therapist, when I sit down and I ask that person, like, you said these things, this is your day, show me where they are. Because everything you're putting your time, effort, and energy into that you say is the priority, which is this person, isn't even on this list. There's nothing that you're doing even remotely close to engaging them that indicates that they're a priority. This is your priority.
To be fair, would you say that honestly most couples do that? This is, of course, exacerbated with the time requirements and just how physiologically demanding it is. But like, how many people who have been in a long-term relationship, I'm not talking about, you know, you're 3 months into dating someone new, like this is like a long-term thing. Like, most people aren't like, oh, it's Wednesday, like how can I prioritize my partner, like what are we going to do together tonight? Like most people. So take that and then add prep onto it.
Correct.
It can certainly make maybe some issues that were already there worse. One thing that I think that is nice about prep, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that a lot of times people can get behind something easier if they know that there's a deadline. Meaning, hey, I'm going to be prepping for the next 4 months. This is going to be a challenging time. This is going to be probably the requirements. Like, can we be on the same page here? Or like if somebody is in school, like, hey, this next semester is going to be really hard. Or I feel like when people are told like, hey, this is going to be this long, they can rationalize it a little bit better. I mean, you can say that's for anything, right? Like, hey, it's going to be 2 years of this. And as long as you know that, like, it feels not easier, but it feels easier than like 1 month, but without knowing, like, when is this going to end? If somebody could tell me, hey, in 5 years, like this and this are going to be lined up, I'd be like, cool, okay. I will literally do anything. I will eat nail polish if I have to like get to that. If I know that in 5 years, I'll get there. Yeah. But if I don't, like, then it's like, there's all these different things going on. So I feel like at least with prep, there is a timeline. However, what most people do notoriously is they'll do a show, then maybe they didn't maybe do how they wanted, then maybe do another one, and then it kind of extends, and then it's like another show, and then, oh, whoops, okay, the whole season, and now I only have a short off season, and I did pretty good, and I was close to like, let me keep going.
Right.
And so that definitely, like, it's not just like, most people aren't like, hey, I have a 14-week prep to the date, and that is it, and then we're wrapping it up. Like, that's generally not how it goes. Like, most people have a season, but still, there is a timeline. So I feel like that does at least help, or at least it should be communicated to the partner, like, this is what I'm going to be diving into, right? Would you agree that that's probably sort of useful?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Setting an expectation so that the person can adjust and say, okay, this is a 3-month process, this is a 7-month process. I can learn to manage these things. You know, I had a client once who did not want to live where she was living, right? And her husband had talked about, well, they made this move because it was beneficial for his career and for their family overall financially and for his career. And it was great. But the expectation was that one day they would return back to where they used to live. And
but not knowing
when that date was like
so stressful.
It was terrible. She felt constantly hopeless, and she didn't feel connected to where she was living. There was nothing she could prepare for. There was just this uncertainty and this anxiety that had been created. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about was I was like, all right, I really want you to sit him down and really push to say, look, I need some sort of date on this. I need a timeline, because then I can set my expectation. And it was supposed to be like 2 years, but immediately she started to have a different perspective on things. Like, she could start to forward think, I would call it. Like, she could look at where they were going to be moving to, when they would be moving, like what houses would be available. She could start to conceptualize the move. And there's something different about something never ending and not knowing when it's going to end versus like, okay, you have 700 days and then we're out of here. Right? So you can prepare yourself. Like, I even gave the example in one of our previous podcasts. I was working out with my trainer, and she's like, you're just going to do this exercise until I say stop. And I was like, well, how many is that? Like, tell me, is that 20? Is that 50? She's like, I'm not going to tell you. You just do it. And it was like, it actually produced anxiety in me, because I was like, I don't know, like, how fast, how hard how intense does this need to go? When she's like, oh, we're going to do a rep range of 12 to 15. Fine.
Got it.
Like, got it. And I can like prepare myself and go. But when she's just like, yeah, you're going to do this until I say stop. What does that mean? You start getting anxious and scratching all over like a fiend. And you're like, I don't know what that means. Tell me. I need direction. So absolutely, having that timeline and that frame helps you conceptualize and prepare mentally and emotionally for something.
And I would say to start the prep, that's going to be an important discussion. And now, to be fair, as a coach, you know, on the coaching side, you can't always guarantee how long or short a prep is going to be, because it is 100% dependent on somebody's body and how they're responding. So I'm not going to say again that you can sit down with someone and say exactly how long it's going to be. But roughly speaking, you know, even if you have no idea, even if it's a shot in the dark, just be like, hey, the next 6 months, give or take, that's going to be probably a good rough estimate. You know,
right.
Maybe a little bit shorter, maybe a little bit longer. It's going to depend. But I would say that, you know, again, from a coaching perspective, I get it. Like, you can't just tell the client how long it's going to be. But giving someone a parameter, because if they aren't familiar with this, they could think, oh, okay, is this like a month? Like, how long is this like a 30-day detox? Like, what do we do? Like, somebody really might not know at all what to expect. And, you know, as far as the partner goes, so that would be important to discuss, like a rough timeline. It doesn't have to be exact. And nobody's going to hold that over your head. Like, you said 6 months and it was 7. Like, no, you know, like, give or take. But having a rough idea of that, I think, would be really important at the beginning of prep, to just explain that. And obviously, if you've prepped before, you'll be able to discuss this with a partner that you're seeing. If you haven't, that's of course going to be like a whole new experience for both of you, because the experience is new for you as the competitor as well. If you're a little bit more seasoned, it's easier to do. But it's still going to be challenging, no matter how. Like I said, I've done so many preps and so many shows, so certain things are significantly easier now. And even though I've been out of this for years, I would still be able to assimilate a lot easier. However, there are certain things that you just can't avoid. You know, the time spent doing these things, it doesn't matter how good, like how efficient you are. Like, you still have to spend a certain amount of time training and doing cardio. You know, even if you're not doing a ton of cardio, you still need to be active for a certain amount of time
Yeah.
per day. You still need to prep all your food. There's no like, oh, I'm just going to wing it and like go down and get a bowl from here. Not the best plan. So there's still time there. And then there's also just those physiological effects. It doesn't matter if you're enhanced or natural. If you are getting lean enough, you are going to be tired. You are going to be food focused. It doesn't like, we always talk about this on the podcast as far as like, you want to start a prep at like 100% because you're going to come down no matter who you are, who your coach is, what protocol you use, doesn't matter. There's going to be decrements in certain areas. But if we start at 100 and we only get to like 70, that's a lot better than starting at like 70 and plummeting to 20 because then everything's a fucking disaster. So I would say that no matter how seasoned you are, there are still going to be certain things. And this goes for any sport. Bodybuilding just happens to be very consuming in really every area and have a lot of interesting physiological effects because with really every other sport outside of when you're trying to make weight, you are fueling for performance and recovery. So you may be tired and exhausted and a little banged up, like for sure, but you're not going to feel the effects quite as hard as doing all that and trying to get below, healthy body fat levels for your gender. So
well, and that's an incredibly important point, which is what makes bodybuilding in the entire physique world different from every other sport.
You're not fueling for performance. You're fueling
not,
to lose body fat.
So whether you're a football player, basketball player, volleyball player, baseball player, swimmer, you're not doing this. You're fueling for performance. So with every sport, there comes inherent sacrifices that you're going to make and lifestyle changes that are going to occur. I get that. Whether you're an amateur, the weekend warrior, or a budding pro, right? You're going to have those things. But where bodybuilding is different is the toll that it takes on the body from this perspective and not just for performance, because everything else is just about being bigger, stronger, faster, and the better athlete who's conditioned better, etc. This is very different. Right. And so I want to talk about some of that. And so when we talk about the relationship, and I loved the idea that you started this off with okay, let's set the expectation for this person with a timeline. Here's something to kind of some fat for you guys to chew on. No pun intended. Think about like
your
this.
Body fat.
If your relationship is already struggling, and I'm going to tell you that, hey, I'm about to enter into something that's going to be 6-7 months where it's going to take a taxing toll on the relationship, is this really the best thing for the relationship, right? And I think some of the people who I work with don't take that into consideration. They're like, this is my life. This is my choice. The quality of my relationship isn't great right now. And now I'm going to specifically do certain things that are going to work against what anybody would look at as being healthy for a relationship. Let me dive into that, right? If I'm dating somebody, if we were dating, and I said, all right, what if I told you, or the listeners who are listening to this, if you're single and a guy came up to you or a girl came up to you and said, hey, I'm going to do these things. What if I told you I was going to actively and consciously do something that would drastically alter my mood, temperament, and emotional response to you, right? Would that be helping the relationship in a healthy way, or would it be detrimental?
I'm intrigued, but
okay.
But I'm also
if I also said I was going to voluntarily spike my sex drive so that for months I wouldn't want to have or initiate sex.
Spike. You mean drop?
Drop, right.
Isn't spike increase?
I guess spike would be increase if you're looking at it from a graph, but spike a volleyball, sometimes things spike down.
Okay.
I don't know. Whatever. Sorry.
Okay.
Drop.
Drop.
In my sex drive?
Yeah. I was drop, I feel like is the normal term.
All right. Then I tell you, I'm also going to spend increasing amounts of time away from you and the family, which is in turn going to increase the burden of responsibility on you to manage the house, the chores, the kids potentially, if there are any. Right? So
this is sounding less appealing now.
Right. Now I'm going to tell you that I'm also going to restrict my ability and my desire to eat out for dinner or enjoy the foods that we've come to know and have or keep in the house even, which in turn can also restrict what you have access to. Then I'm going to tell you that I'm purposely going to do things that are going to make me irritable, give me low energy, and basically be obsessive about this particular goal of mine, which, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with you.
Sign me up.
Right. So I realize I didn't paint competing in a really flattering
Yeah,
light
I'm like,
there.
damn, Rick.
But I'm not talking about competing. I'm talking about the relationship.
Yeah.
And this is a part that I think gets overlooked, if it even gets examined at all, prior to people making this decision who have significant others. So for those of you who have a husband or a wife who is like all in your corner cheering you on for this, go give them a big hug and tell them thank you and do something special for them, because they are sacrificing as much for you in the pursuit of your goals as you are. And they didn't ask for it. Unless you have the one person who's like, please go be a bikini pro, right? But most people that I know, their husbands, their wives, they're not asking for them to do this. This isn't something that is a relationship goal for most people. This is something that is 100% self-motivated and selfish. So let's not confuse that. This is about you. This is about your goals. And your goals are going to take a toll and require sacrifices from all the people around you. In particular, your significant other. So if you're not thinking about that and you're just going about your way competing and then bitching about the fact that this person's not being supportive of you, I would challenge you to say you're not being supportive of them. You're not thinking about this from their perspective, and you're the one who's being selfish. And that's a reality that I want people to start to confront in this space. I'm not saying don't compete, but I'm saying stop being naive. And let's go into this with like real information, real knowledge, and understand how this is going to impact your relationship.
And real expectations. And that's what we try to bring up on the show in a variety of ways, which is why I love these types of podcasts, because this is not something that when I first started competing, I even thought of course. And to be honest, I don't think a lot of people do. Most people don't even think about the repercussions after a show, let alone the physically, let alone the repercussions on their relationships.
Right.
And I mean, to some degree, they might think, okay, are these people going to be supportive of me? But to be fair, also, I think a lot of times the partner is like, yeah, go do that. I want to be supportive of you. I support you in all your goals. But they don't really know what's going to be happening either. So I think that for the first time competitor, this can really be eye-opening for both parties, because I think that a lot of people really do want to be supportive of their partner, but they don't really understand what that is going to look like, to be to your point. You know, okay, the emotional up and downs, the like lack of energy and like not going to be as social and all of that. And again, as you get more advanced as a competitor, and you've done this more, you can handle those things a little bit easier. But again, there is still just a time where you got to get stuff done, you know, and that either lands on you and your schedule or not. And if you're talking about, you know, there's periods of time where I would go and do things, and I got to a point where I was like, I'm not going to let this stop me from doing other things. Obviously, I don't have the option. Like, I have to like work and travel and do all this. And, you know, my last several years competing, I was doing a lot of that. And I would always, you know, go out to eat, even if I just got a hot tea or water, you know what I mean? Or just pickles. You know, there were so many times where I just go get pickles. So you feel like you're having something.
Never mind. I was going to say, why pickles?
Like, they're calorie free.
Zero calorie.
You just have something. Like if we're at like a burger place after a show with clients, like, okay, I'll have some pickles. Like, you know, so, but I might be staying up till late, right? Might go to dinner after the show, and I still got to get up and do cardio. So at some point it still has to land on somebody, sometime, some way. Like, you have to get it all done. But you can do a few days of that, and then you come back and you're completely smoked, and then you're not thinking about really anybody else. You're barely even thinking about yourself. You're just trying to get through like the next day. You know, if we're talking about like the end of a prep. So, you know, we don't say this to be dramatic, and we don't like the way that we talk about competing. We don't say this in a negative light. I just want to make sure that people understand what they're getting into. It's all about this informed consent around it. What is involved before, during, and after on all fronts, because this isn't just something, you know, that you're just going to kind of casually jump into, because it's not something that you're going to want to casually jump into, because that's going to be kind of embarrassing. This isn't like a, you know, like, oh, I dieted for like, you know, a few weeks and I just got on stage. Like, this is, okay, I'm going to like really invest. There's a lot of time and money that goes into this, and you want to do a good job. So there's just a lot that needs to go into that expectation and understanding. And I think that both parties sometimes are like, yeah, like this will be easy. This will be straightforward. Or the partner will be like, I'll be supportive. And then they're like, you know, a few months in, they're like, what the fuck is this?
I didn't know this is what supportive looked like and meant.
So I think it just requires a conversation on both ends. And if you are somebody who has competed before, and maybe you are entering a new relationship, this would be something that, hey, you really need to discuss this with the other person. Like, this is, maybe I'm not doing this right now, but this could be something that I want to do in the future, or this is something that I'm actively doing, and really kind of explain those things to this person, because it's, you don't want to be a few months in and then that is adding more stress, right?
Correct.
Like now your relationship is falling apart. And then that's just adding a whole different layer.
Right. And so I think one of the areas that I want to talk about moving and transitioning from that is helping people understand what are the most common signs and symptoms of that relationships begin to fail. Like, what are the kind of categories that manifest where when these things are present, a large portion, like 80, 90% of relationships start to fail. Okay, so there's like 4 basic categories that most clinicians would agree that when these things are present in a relationship, it certainly isn't going to be good, because it's these categories kind of indicate like a toxic, unhealthy relationship. So number 1 would be indifference, and these are in no particular order: neglect, obviously violence, and then feelings of contempt. And so let me kind of go through. First, I'm not going to spend any time on violence. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm not just talking about like huge signs of physical or sexual abuse or something like that. I'm talking about like even small things, acts of aggression, words that we use. Like those things can help deteriorate a relationship very quickly. But we're not going to focus on that. So one of the first ones I want to talk about would be indifference, right? So what does indifference actually look like, or how does it manifest within the relationship? What are the thoughts that we have kind of surrounding that, so that we can identify when I am feeling indifferent, right? Because sometimes people struggle to pinpoint the emotion. So it's kind of like a feeling like the other person doesn't care about you and that you don't care about them, right? It's that kind of like what they think, what they feel, who they are, what they're about. Not really important, right? They're just kind of degrading you, and that you don't really matter. And that's important, because if I don't feel like I matter, human beings are creatures of meaning. We want a significant, what does significant mean? Important, right? That has meaning to it. Your significant other is supposed to be somebody that means something to you. And if within that relationship, you're doing things that don't make me a priority in any way, shape, or form, and more to the point, you're participating in something that pulls away from the meaning of us, indifference begins to set in. And so when I was reading through that list of things that like, I'm going to consciously do these things, right? Like I'm going to alter my mood, my temperament. I'm going to withdraw from sex in the relationship. I'm going to spend tons of time and energy away from you and the family and the kids. I'm going to restrict what I eat and the things that we enjoy. I'm going to make myself more irritable, have low energy. Do you not think that that's going to make somebody feel indifferent? That your choices are going to make me feel less important in this relationship? Of course they are. Right? So then I want to talk about neglect, and what does neglect actually look like, right? Neglect is where we take each other for granted. This is where it might look like you care more about your competition than you do about me or this relationship, right? Which, as you described while you were preparing, like when you were running through all the things you needed to do when you were preparing for a competition, like you're getting up, you're going to the lab, you're spending 6 hours there, then you're going to do your first cardio session, then you're going to rest or do something else, and then you're going to go back and do a second cardio, a second workout, and then you're going to come home and you're going to be completely exhausted. I didn't hear any part of the relationship in there, right? Are you neglecting that? Is your competition more of a priority than I am? Yes, it is. And you don't get to say that it isn't, because it is. Mm-hmm. If I were to look at the amount of time you're putting into the relationship versus the amount of time you're putting into the aspect of your competition, which one's going to win? Right? And when we stack that against your work or your school obligations or other things that you have going on in your life, where's the relationship falling in there? Right? This is when we talk about it's being taken for granted, because it is. Okay? And so I think what I need people to understand, what I want people to understand, is that when you're doing this, the competition becomes the priority, not the relationship. And so you're no longer putting effort into something, but you're expecting it to maintain anyway. And it doesn't work that way. You just think or assume this is just supposed to exist without any of the work or effort to maintain it. And that's where these things start to fall apart. And then the last one would be contempt. One of the better ways to describe contempt would just be kind of underlying feelings of intense anger and potentially hate toward your partner. Real, true resentment. basically kind of thoughts would be like, you're nothing to me. Just that complete disconnect from that person. And so in this relationship with competition, these are some of the signs and symptoms that your partners will internalize against themselves and against the relationship. And this is where it becomes really difficult, because if you haven't set an expectation, and I don't know how long this is supposed to last, and you're doing everything that's involved in competing, which has an ancillary side effect of basically pulling away from all the nutrition and value that goes into building a relationship, but you're expecting it to thrive. And more importantly, you're relying on me to be the person who's maintaining the relationship through this. So your goals have now become the priority of the relationship, and it's my expectation to manage the relationship while you pursue your goals. If this doesn't seem one-sided, we have bigger issues, right? There's some other parts of this that we really need to reflect on. And again, I'm not saying don't compete. I am saying I don't want you to be naive in this process and think that it's just about the competition, and that the only thing that's happening is you're the one who's sacrificing because you're tired or you're hungry or you're fatigued. It's not. And I want you to start looking at the bigger picture and understand how this is affecting the people around you.
Yeah, and it is a big decision when you are, whether you're newly dating someone or you've been in a, long-term relationship. I would say it's probably even harder in the long-term relationship. Just because, again, some of these things get comfortable, and the taken for granted thing, this can happen. Really, what you described obviously was not just for competing. That is for anything that could be ending a relationship.
Absolutely.
Adding competing on top of that, your whole point with this is don't be surprised when things are strained. Don't look up and be like, what happened? I don't understand.
Right. Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
The point of this is to really elucidate, this is going to be a lot of work. This is going to be a lot of effort on both sides. And there needs to be effort on both sides in order for things to even maintain, let alone thrive. Thriving is obviously very different, right? And this might be a time period where you say, you know what, this is something that I want to do for myself, whether it's you or the partner or whatever it is. I want to focus on us just maintaining here. But even just having that conversation, I don't think most people are having, right?
Right.
It's just probably not happening. So it is something that you have to really take into consideration. And, even if you are just trying to maintain it, that's still going to take work. That's still going to take, to your point from the beginning, balance. So it can't just be take, and then expecting, someone to just be there. Because what's going to happen is, even if they are fine with you doing all that, right? Okay, hey, you're going to go compete. You're going to go prep for 5 months. You're going to do this, whatever. Okay, I know that. I'm chilling. I'm doing my own thing. But what ends up happening is that you end up looking up, and then you're like, wait, now we've both been doing our own thing for a while. Where are we? Who are we? Because it's not that you weren't being supportive of each other. You were being supportive of each other, but you weren't being supportive of each other in the relationship.
Right.
And I think that can happen whether you both are competitors or one is and one isn't. I think it's just a matter of not necessarily that person isn't supporting you, because they are supporting you, but they are supporting that goal, and then they're kind of doing their own thing. But now, again, at some point, that's going to be over. And then it's wait, what happened?
Right.
Well, what happened was both of you were so focused on your own things or being separate that now there's no longer that joint relationship.
Right. Exactly. And so one of the things that I want to do is, as we have progressed through this podcast, I want to talk about this big concept. And I've kind of nicknamed it the bounce back. How are you bouncing back from this? And what I mean by that is I want to bring awareness to the sacrifices that your partner is making. And here's a really important piece that I want you guys to remember. Simply returning back to what life was pre-competition isn't enough. Okay? What I mean by that is you don't get to tax the relationship to a point where maybe it almost breaks and then bring it back up to just normal and expect everything to be level, right? If I came to you and said, Lauren, I need to borrow a bunch of money, right? And in me borrowing that money from you, it meant you had to make sacrifices and change your lifestyle, and you couldn't go places or do things or do anything that you wanted. And then I came back after I fulfilled all of my goals and just said, well, here it is. Thanks. Right? Tell me there's not a part of you that's going to feel a little bit of resentment there.
Got a little bit of contempt here.
Right. You might think twice before lending me that money again. Okay. And so what I'm saying is how are you going backwards?
Yeah.
And going to refill the tank more on their side. If this is a teeter-totter, right, and the relationship is supposed to be balanced, 50-50 in some way, shape, or form in the relationship, right? And I'm not talking about roles. Like one person might be like, it's my job to take care of the house while you earn money. Fine. That's a balance to me. If both of you value those roles, I'm not talking about like, I have to work, you have to work. I'm talking about what the relationship quality was prior to the competition. In some ways should be even. And so if I'm the one who's going to be taxing the relationship because my goals are, well, now it's shifted, right? And now I'm getting all of the effort, the attention, the time, everything from the relationship, and I'm depleting these resources from you, right? It's not just enough sometimes to bring it back even, because what's the other side of this? When does the other person actually become the priority again? What I basically said is, I'm the priority, you have to make sacrifices. And now that I'm done, we can both go back to being priorities. Well, is there a point where you get to bounce back and maybe show the other person some of that gratitude and allow them to pursue goals, allow them to do certain things and be more selfish in their time, in their endeavors, in their pursuit? How are you going back and filling their love tank over what it was before? And this is where this concept of how does the relationship thrive is really important. Because if I depleted the relationship, it's not just enough to bring it back up to a neutral space. I need to replenish this, right? I need to put more money in the bank than what you gave me. So this way, when I come to you and say, hey, I need to take some more money out again, you're going to be like, cool, I got something out of this. And don't kid yourself. Like, love is conditional. I always, it bothers me when people are like, well, they're supposed to love me unconditionally. They don't. Love has conditions. You want me to prove it? If your partner came back and told you they cheated on you with 5 different people, how are you going to feel? Are you going to just forgive them right away and move on and never be impacted by that? Most of the people listening to this podcast would be like, I'm going to leave this person. So you just proved that love is conditional, right? It is. And so you don't get to deplete from it and not give it back. There is a give and a take for the partnership. And so I would ask you, I would say things, challenge you to think about, how are you rebalancing this relationship, right? How are you improving your mood and your temperament and your emotional response to the person? How are you now approaching sex in the relationship, right? Because this is obviously, sex is one of the biggest things I hear about in the relationship, whether the other person is the competitor or they're the competitor. Everybody's like, yeah, my sex drive is gone. It doesn't exist. Whether you're enhanced or natural, doesn't matter. Right? So are you initiating? Are you making effort to engage your partner? Are you working to fulfill fantasies or try new things? Are you filling up their love tank in whatever their love language might be? If it's not through sexual activity, are you spending quality time? Are you doing acts of kindness for them or service? Right? I don't want you thinking about this just in terms of returning back to pre-competition life. I want you to think about, I want to bounce back and reward this person for their loyalty and their commitment to my goals. Because you didn't ask for this. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't know too many people who are going to complain about having a really in shape, beautiful partner. That's great. And we're all going to appreciate that. And that person's probably going to enjoy that.
Debatable.
Okay. Maybe.
The end of a prep is like so gross. Like people see, because you've never seen me show ready, right?
No.
So photos look so different. Photos are super glamorous, and photos are like under the stage lights, and you have a pump and you've carved up and you look like this for an hour. And also photos make somebody look bigger, like everybody, right? And most of the time at the end of a prep, like I kind of always joke, but like literally you look like a wet noodle, just like walking around, and everybody thinks like, oh my God, like look at the girl's glute. No, you got no ass. Like you got no ass if you're lean enough. In order to have tie-ins, most people have to have small glutes, like small in terms of like what they used to look like, you know what I mean? So it's like you look great in a bikini, you look great after 2 hours of leg day and like intra-workout carbs and a refeed, but most of the time, like getting ready for the show is not glamorous. The night before you're like, can you shave my back? And like you're just like a wet rat in like the shower and like so sad and bony. So yeah, it's a whole, I would say that there are certainly perks of being leaner and all of that, and up to a certain point I would say that you look pretty good for most people's standards. Everybody has a different standard, of course, but at some point you kind of just look gross. Okay. Like you just do. It is kind of funny because people see those pictures, and even clients will be like, oh, I love how the person looks, and I'm like, no, you like that look is very different than what it actually looks like and what it feels like. Like it is horrible. But yeah,
Okay.
Try to add that in there.
Well, and I think
For anybody listening who has like doesn't know, you know what I mean? Like
I wouldn't have known
if you
that.
know, you know, and it is a certain feeling of like that just. But you have to do that in order to get lean enough. Like if you don't get past that gross point, you're not lean enough, you know? So everything comes, you know, at a cost. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, I know we're talking about this in terms of competing and we do want to keep that pretty focused there, but I really don't know if a lot of people even think about this in general in a relationship. Like just in general, right? Like thinking about having like this thriving relationship, like what do we put into this? And even if it isn't competing, like there's going to be harder periods of time for anything that you're pursuing. And I don't think that people are having this conversation.
They're not, you know, working in relationships in general, regardless of whether or not the people are competing or even lifting weights at that point, working out.
Yeah, this could be a work goal. Or
this is just a relationship goal, period. Yeah. And I think the dynamic still plays out, and it's absolutely still 100% relevant. I sit down with people and I'm like, okay, tell me about your day, right? And then they do everything. They're like the kids, work out, whatever it is, job. And at the end of the day, you know, they're both laying in bed and like somebody's like, hey, do you want to have sex? You know, and I'm like, no, like I don't. Why? Because the romance is gone. There's no spark. There's nothing that gives me intrigue. What you're basically saying is I'm the leftover thing at the end of the day. And like, this is an obligation, not something you actually want to do. Well, who wants to engage in that? And so the reality is when we start a relationship, we're completely engaged and we're texting and we're talking and we're communicating and we're going on dates and I'm thinking about the person. And then over the course of that 1 to 2 years, that excitement kind of fades. We start settling into a more longer term relationship. Well, now we're 5, 10, 15 years down the road. This is when it's most important. And this is when people start hitting these roadblocks. And you start looking at them and you're like, what have you been doing to build the relationship, to thrive in the relationship, right? And
this might also be the time where somebody is like, I need to do something new because this other thing is kind of just at this lower level. So let me go after this goal, which is totally fine. But if this now is going to maybe lead to some excitement personally, but then put even more strain on the relationship, it might not, you know, like you could grow closer because of this and there could be a lot of support. But the point of this is to just give some context to what could happen and what often does happen because there is no communication.
Right.
And there is no discussion about this and there is no context to any of these things.
Right. And so I guess I would just ask you guys as we're signing off on this particular podcast, the thought, I guess, to leave you with the concept would be when you look at competing is good for you as the individual. It's not good for the relationship. Okay. And if you start asking yourself, what is good for the relationship, you quickly realize like a lot of the elements of competing deteriorate and take away from the relationship. And so it's equally important to say, all right, if I'm going to do this, how am I going to bounce back in the relationship? How am I going to go past pre-comp? How am I going to demonstrate and fill up their love? How am I going to bid for their attention? When I talk about bids, I'm actually talking about ways to turn toward the person, right? And maybe it's a separate topic. We don't have to really get into that today.
Yeah, that'd be a good separate. The relationship ones, there's always so many questions about this. And I think that a lot of people, I don't know, maybe it's just my experience, but like this is just not discussed in these types of ways. I feel like relationships are talked a lot about in terms of like the initial stuff and like maybe like I would say dating, but maybe not even like, you know, I don't know. Yeah. I just feel like we can definitely do another one on that.
Yeah. Well, to conceptualize what a bid is like basically an attempt to engage and seek attention from your partner, right? And that can be done in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about that later, but I want you to understand that if I were to create a list of do's and don'ts for a relationship, how many of those don'ts would be involved in this process? And so the idea becomes, am I looking at the relationship in terms of what is good for the relationship, or am I looking at it in terms of what is good for the individual? Because you can both be two individuals, but in a relationship, you're not individuals anymore. You're a completely new living, breathing entity, and you have to exist, or I want you to exist in a space that is like, what is best for this entity isn't necessarily what is best for me as an individual. And that gets reversed when we're thinking about competition, because competition is a solo, selfish endeavor. And I don't care what competition you are, right? Whether it's jiu-jitsu or basketball or being the best in whatever it is that you do, that's a selfish endeavor. And this is about helping the relationship maintain and survive and then eventually thrive through that process. So I hope that this like provided some level of insight and awareness to people and gives you some guidelines to start to say, all right, I'm preparing for some shows next year maybe now's the time to start greasing some of those wheels, guys and girls, and really starting to fill up that love tank so that the person's even more on board with helping you achieve your goals.
And just having these discussions and being as honest as you can be, because if this is your first time competing, neither of you are going to know how this is going to play out. You can have an idea, but you're not really going to know. So it is going to be a learning curve. But even being open with that, like, hey, this is totally brand new to me. Like, I have an idea of how long this is going to take and kind of how I'm going to feel based on all these other things. But this is how we're going to have to navigate this. And like, we need to have an open discussion about this, and we're going to need to check ourselves here, and like just set up things, because what you struggle with anyway, like on a normal kind of even keel basis. So just take that times 10. That's probably what you're going to struggle with, further down the line. So just prepare for all that. And again, this is not to say not to compete or not to do this, but this is simply to give some more awareness and context to the situation, and just have this kind of informed consent about it. So thank you guys so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. We will definitely do a what did you call it? Turning towards bids.
Working on bids.
Working on bids. Okay. We will do a podcast on that. If you guys have any questions, you can send them to info@teamlocofit.com, or there is a anonymous link below in the show notes to contact Rick for therapy sessions. His contact information will also be in the show notes. And for all their information on coaching services and products that we offer, you can visit teamlocofit.com, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter to be the first to hear about the app we'll be releasing very soon. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you next week.